It wasn't cruel. I did what was right. I just disappeared. His last book was about relationships and trust, a cruel irony, I realized later. At the time, I told myself I was overreacting. The long nights, the guarded phone calls, the sudden need for privacy, it could all be explained away. Writers are eccentric, I thought. Ethan always had his quirks. But there's a difference between quirky and deceitful, and I wish I'd seen it sooner. The seminar was the beginning of the end. It was a packed event in one of those stately old theaters with velvet curtains and gleaming brass railings. I wasn't supposed to be there. Ethan insisted it was unnecessary, that I'd find the discussions tiresome, and he'd already told me every story he'd planned to share. Maybe that was why I went, slipping into the back row unnoticed. He looked at ease on the stage, his easy grin and rich voice captivating the audience. I remembered when that charisma was reserved for me, but it had been years since I felt that spark. Then I saw her. She was in the second row, a brunette with sharp cheekbones, bold red lips, and an air of confidence that radiated like a spotlight. Every time Ethan glanced her way, something passed between them, a flicker of familiarity, a faint but unmistakable smile. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. My mind was filling in blanks that weren't there. But when the intermission came, and I saw her slip out of her seat and disappear backstage, my heart sank. I didn't think. I acted. Keeping my head down, I weaved through the crowd and found the side entrance to the green room. My pulse hammered in my ears as I pushed the door open a crack, enough to see but not be seen. There they were. She stood close to him, her hand resting lightly on his forearm as they spoke in low tones. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. The way Ethan looked at her, the way he leaned in, it was everything he'd stopped giving me. His laughter came easy, warm, unrestrained. It felt like a blade sliding between my ribs. I stepped back into the corridor, closing the door silently, and leaned against the wall. My mind raced, a tornado of disbelief, anger, and the faintest whisper of self-doubt. But deep down, I knew. I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding or an innocent moment taken out of context. Ethan had betrayed me. I left the seminar that night without saying a word. When I left the seminar, the cool night air hit me like a slap. It did nothing to clear my thoughts. I walked to my car on autopilot, gripping my keys so tightly they left imprints on my palm. The drive home was a blur. By the time I stepped into our house, the silence felt suffocating. I dropped my purse on the kitchen counter, stood in the middle of the room, and stared at nothing. Ethan wouldn't be home for hours, probably too busy basking in the adoration of his audience, and her. That night, I slept in the guest room. Or rather, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the scene over and over. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. I needed to be sure. The decision wasn't born of hesitation. It was strategy. Ethan was clever, he made a living constructing believable lies in his novels. If I was going to unravel his betrayal, I needed to be just as calculated. I searched for a private investigator the next day, settling on a man named Daniel Hargrove. His reviews were excellent, and his no-nonsense demeanor during our first phone call put me at ease. "Mrs. Lanning," he said after I explained the situation, "I'll handle this discreetly. It'll take a few weeks to gather solid evidence. Is that timeframe acceptable?" "It's fine," I replied. "I'm in no rush." That was a lie. Every day felt like torture, but I didn't want to tip Ethan off. Daniel moved quickly. Within days, he'd tracked the woman from the seminar, Caroline Ford, a marketing consultant Ethan had hired to expand his reach. I nearly laughed when Daniel said it. The irony of Ethan needing someone else to market a book about trust was almost unbearable. Daniel sent me photos. Ethan and Caroline at a cafe, their heads close together. At a bookstore, her hand brushing his as she handed him a stack of papers. At a hotel, where they disappeared through the glass doors late one evening. Each image was a dagger, but I studied them all, committing every detail to memory. I wanted to be haunted by them, to fuel my resolve. Ethan's behavior at home changed, too. He grew more distant, his excuses for late nights more frequent and less convincing. I began to see him clearly for the first time in years, a man who had perfected the art of lying. The turning point came 2 weeks later when Daniel handed me a manila envelope. "This is everything," he said, sliding it across the table. "Hotel receipts, messages, photos. It's airtight." I opened it in the privacy of my car, trembling as I flipped through the contents. There were texts between Ethan and Caroline, some explicit, others nauseatingly sweet. The photos were damning, leaving no room for interpretation. But it was the receipts that sealed it. The dates matched the nights he claimed to be working late. He even charged some of it to our joint credit card, too careless, or too confident, to hide it. I sat there for a long time, the envelope on my lap, my thoughts racing. This was it. Proof of his infidelity. Proof that the life I thought we shared was a lie. That night, I began planning my disappearance. Leaving wasn't just about walking out the door. It was about erasing myself, making sure Ethan would never find me. I didn't want revenge, just freedom, clean, silent, and absolute. The first step was preparation. Over the next week, I started untangling myself from our shared life. Quietly. Methodically. I opened a new bank account under my maiden name, transferring small amounts of money every few days so it wouldn't raise suspicion. I rented a storage unit across town to stash essentials, clothes, cash, and documents. Every interaction with Ethan became an act. When he came home late smelling of her perfume, I played the dutiful wife. When he kissed my cheek distractedly and muttered excuses about work, I nodded with feigned understanding. But I was counting down the days. Daniel, the private investigator, helped me with the logistics. He didn't ask why I wanted to vanish, he didn't need to. He provided resources, tips on avoiding digital footprints, advice on setting up a new identity, and even contacts who could assist if I needed to move out of the country. "You'll need to leave your phone behind," he advised. "It's the easiest way for someone to track you." "Got it," I said, adding it to my growing checklist. My biggest challenge was timing. I wanted Ethan to be completely blindsided. That meant leaving during one of his out-of-town book events. Luckily, there was one coming up, a weekend seminar in New York. On the day of his flight, I helped him pack, smiling as he kissed my forehead and promised to call every night. As soon as his car disappeared down the street, I sprang into action. I had already rented a small apartment in a different city under an alias. It wasn't glamorous, a modest one-bedroom with outdated carpet and a faint smell of paint, but it was mine. A fresh start. I left no trace of myself in our home. No notes, no clues, nothing to hint at where I'd gone. I packed only what I could carry, essentials and sentimental items that couldn't be replaced. Everything else, I left behind. The final touch was a letter I had written weeks earlier, carefully worded and devoid of emotion. "Ethan. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. You've spent so much time crafting lies, I thought I'd save you the trouble of explaining mine. I know about Caroline. I know about the hotels, the messages, the nights you thought I wouldn't notice. But this isn't about anger. It's about liberation, yours and mine. Don't look for me. Don't call. Consider this my final gift to you, a clean break, a chance to live your life without the burden of a wife you clearly don't want. Take care." I placed the letter in an envelope on the kitchen counter, next to his favorite coffee mug. It was the only thing I left behind. The drive to my new apartment felt surreal, like stepping out of a nightmare and into a dream. For the first time in years, I felt free. No lies, no tension, no gnawing suspicion eating away at my sanity. I deleted all my social media accounts that evening, wiped my email inbox, and turned off my phone for the last time before dropping it into a trash bin at a gas station miles from my new home. Ethan would return in 2 days. By then, I'd be a ghost. In the weeks following my disappearance, I waited for the other shoe to drop. I knew Ethan would come looking for me. A man like him couldn't stomach the idea of losing control. But I didn't care. I imagined the moment he came home to find the house hollowed out, the letter staring back at him from the counter. I pictured him pacing the empty rooms, trying to piece together what went wrong, who to call, where to start. It gave me a strange satisfaction, not vengeance, but closure. Still, I took precautions. I didn't settle in one place too long. The apartment I'd rented was temporary, just a stepping stone. Over the next month, I used what Daniel taught me to create a new identity. A new bank account under the name Claire Benson. A simple wardrobe purchased in cash. Even my car was traded for an older model that wouldn't attract attention. The first weeks were quiet. Unsettlingly so. I had spent years with Ethan's presence looming in my life, whether physically or emotionally. Without him, the silence felt alien. But as time passed, I began to embrace it. I found a job at a small, family-owned bookstore in a sleepy coastal town a few hours from the city. The pay was modest, but it was enough, and the work was soothing. Shelving books, recommending novels to curious customers, it reminded me of who I used to be before my life became entangled with Ethan's. I rented a small cottage on the edge of town, nestled between towering pines. It had a porch with a creaky swing and a view of the sea. At night, I'd sit outside with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, sipping tea and listening to the waves crash against the shore. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I knew he was looking for me. It wasn't hard to imagine him pulling every string, calling every mutual contact, maybe even hiring his own investigator. But I'd covered my tracks well. One day, while scrolling through the news at the library, I came across an article about Ethan. It was a puff piece about his book tour, but a single line made my chest tighten. Rumors swirl about the author's recent marital troubles, with his wife's sudden absence fueling speculation. I closed the browser and sat back, staring at the screen. Marital troubles. That was one way to describe it. I imagined him painting himself as the victim, abandoned by a wife who just couldn't handle the demands of his career. He was good at spinning stories, after all. But none of it mattered to me anymore. In the bookstore, I was Claire Benson, the quiet but friendly woman who always had a book recommendation. People in the town grew to recognize me, greeting me warmly when they passed by. I started painting again, something I hadn't done in years. The cottage's sunlit living room became my makeshift studio, canvases leaning against the walls, brushes, and tubes of paint strewn across the table. It wasn't a grand reinvention. I didn't travel the world or start a new career. I didn't need to. It was the small things that made me feel whole, the smell of the ocean, the rustle of pages in the bookstore, the solitude I had fought so hard to reclaim. One evening, months later, a man came into the bookstore. He was tall, with a kind smile and an easy demeanor. His name was Andrew, a local teacher who had just moved to town. He asked for a book recommendation, and we fell into conversation. It was innocent at first, chats about literature, shared laughs over small-town quirks. But as the weeks went on, I realized I was smiling more, laughing more. Andrew didn't pry into my past. He didn't ask why I seemed hesitant or why I avoided certain topics. He just let me be. One evening, as we walked along the beach, he stopped and turned to me. "You seem like someone who's finally found peace," he said softly. I looked out at the waves, the golden light of the setting sun stretching across the water, and realized he was right. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a ghost of myself. I was no longer the woman Ethan had broken or the wife who disappeared without a trace. I was Claire Benson, a woman who had reclaimed her life. And I didn't care if Ethan was still searching. Months turned into a year, and the life I built as Claire Benson began to feel less like a facade and more like the truth. My days were filled with quiet joys, the smell of coffee at the bookstore, the satisfaction of finishing a new painting, and the warmth of Andrew's companionship. He became a steady presence in my life, never overbearing but always kind. We took things slowly, though I suspected he knew there were parts of me I hadn't shared. I wasn't ready to give him everything, and he respected that. But the past has a way of catching up, no matter how well you hide. It happened on a gray afternoon, just as the autumn winds began to creep in. I was sweeping the bookstore floor when the bell over the door chimed. I glanced up, expecting one of the regulars, and froze. Ethan stood there, his face pale and drawn, his eyes scanning the shop until they landed on me. "Claire," he said, his voice breaking the silence. For a moment, the world tilted. I gripped the broom tightly, steadying myself. "It's Hannah," I corrected, my voice steady. "And I don't know who you are." His brow furrowed, and he took a step closer. "Don't do that. I know it's you. I've been looking for you for over a year. I just want to talk." I set the broom aside and crossed my arms. "Talk about what?" "How you lied. How you cheated. How you took everything we had and smashed it." Ethan winced, his hand running through his disheveled hair. "I made mistakes. I know that. But I didn't know you'd leave. You didn't even give me a chance to fix it." I laughed bitterly. "Fix it? You were sleeping with her for months, Ethan. What exactly was there to fix?" He opened his mouth to respond but faltered. For the first time, he looked small, like a man who had lost everything. "I just want to make things right," he said quietly. "You can't," I replied, my tone soft but firm. "You don't get to walk into my life now and pretend you care. I'm done being part of your story." His shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I loved you," he said finally, his voice breaking. "No, you loved yourself," I said. "And I won't let you drag me back into the life I left behind." Ethan stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for me to change my mind. When I didn't, he nodded once and left, the bell chiming softly behind him. Andrew found me sitting on the porch later that evening, staring out at the sea. He handed me a cup of tea and sat beside me, waiting for me to speak. "Ethan came by today," I said finally. Andrew didn't react, just sipped his tea and nodded. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "Like I made the right choice," I said. "I think I needed to see him, to realize I'm not the same person he left behind." Andrew smiled, his hand brushing mine. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." I looked at him, the warmth of his words sinking in. For the first time in years, I didn't feel tethered to my past. Ethan didn't come back. Whether he finally accepted my absence or was too ashamed to try again, I didn't know. As time passed, I found myself thinking about him less and less. The pain he caused became a distant memory, replaced by the life I had built for myself. Andrew and I grew closer, though I was careful not to rush into anything. He didn't fill the void Ethan left, he wasn't a replacement. Instead, he became a new chapter, a reminder that life could move forward. On a crisp spring morning, as the first flowers bloomed along the coast, I stood on the porch of my little cottage, sipping coffee and watching the waves. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. I had been broken, betrayed, and lost, but I had found my way back to myself. And I didn't care if Ethan ever found closure, because I had already written the ending to my story.